I'm going to talk to you about my book. And this talk will be in 4 parts. I'm going to start by sort of telling you why I was motivated to write it. And then I'll explain what it's about. And in the 3rd part, I'm going to talk about my difficulties in getting it published. And then finally reflect on why it was difficult, because I think there's some things there that are relevant to everyone working in this field. So my background is in the sociology of medicine, which is sort of quite an unusual discipline, really. It's concerned with things like the sociological analysis of medical institutions, the functions of medicine, and the production of medical knowledge. And it was this the study of the production of medical knowledge interested me, because I began to realize that animal research was, a really large foundation for medical research and practice. And in fact, the rise of modern medicine was very closely allied to the rise of laboratory medicine. So that sort of piqued my interest to begin with as an undergraduate. But then once I graduated and started to work as a researcher in medical schools, I began to think about this topic a bit more closely, and particularly when I was working at St Thomas's Hospital Medical School, where I actually was working quite close to the animal labs, and I used to have to walk past them every day to get to my office, and occasionally saw animals being brought in and out through this long service tunnel that ran below the medical school, and it emerged in the Department of Public Health, which was where I was working at the time. And so it did bring this issue much closer to me. A couple of years later, the site was abandoned. And in fact, it was photographed by urban explorers later on. And these are some of the photos that they took. And I'm just going to read you a very small excerpt from the book, which is about the photos, really, and this laboratory, which I'd never actually seen myself. Plastic pots containing samples of rat organs littered the surfaces of offices, scattered alongside empty boxes and vials of hypnor, an anaesthetic commonly used in experimental surgery. Peeling paint hung in swathes from the ceilings of empty laboratories, and the semicircular bench in the lecture theatre was now bright green with moss. The service tunnel stretched into blackness, and in dim, windowless spaces, the gates of barren steel cages and pens stood open, some still containing the animals' feeding bowls. According to an ex-student who commented on these photographs, some of the larger cages had housed monkeys and sheep, and I was left wondering what, if anything, these animals living in these dark cages had contributed to human medicine. So this was the question that was really interesting me at the time. Does animal research benefit humans? And to actually find an answer to that, it's quite difficult in the late 90s, early noughties. You would look at the literature and you'd find sort of assertions like this: animal experimentation is a valuable research method which has proved itself over time. Or this one, which is quite famous: virtually every medical achievement of the last century has depended directly or indirectly on research with animals. But there was never very robust evidence for backing up these statements. There used to be, a few isolated examples might be presented as evidence. But I was interested in whether there might be more robust evidence, since, the benefits for humans are actually the justification for using animals in research. So a bit later on, and when I was at Bristol University, I got together with some epidemiologists who were interested in this topic, and we wrote a paper asking where is the evidence that animal research benefits humans. And we were particularly interested in trying to find or encourage the use of more systematic evidence, so particularly systematic reviews which are able to synthesize and analyze large bodies of data. This is a very robust, objective and transparent form of producing evidence. And it had been used very successfully in clinical research to build an evidence base there, and we were arguing that it should be used in the field of animal studies. So in the years that followed, There were a number of systematic reviews of animal studies were conducted, and all sorts of other studies, including analysis of the use of animals in predicting human toxicology, the predictive ability of animal research, and a whole slew of papers which were looking at the methodology of animal research, need for randomization and so on, and also a few studies that were looking at animal to human translation. The British Medical Journal was understandably very interested in this debate because they're of course interested in the outcomes for humans. After a couple of, maybe a decade or so, it became clear that on the basis of this evidence, good evidence, that animal studies were not conducted according to accepted scientific standards. That much research wasn't usable, so animals were being wasted and other resources were being wasted. And there were grave doubts about clinical translation. So I was really shocked actually by this evidence. I had thought that in a morally contested field such as animal research, that surely scientists would take care to do their research, as well as possible, make each animal's life count and produce useful findings. And it was really this that made me want to make the evidence available in for the general public in a more popular science type of book. When I began to write it, it broadened out a bit, so I looked also at the history and the regulation of animal research. But I've sort of kept away from the ethics of animal research in terms of animal suffering, because I feel that this has been investigated quite a lot already. I also felt that there is a knowledge gap. So despite the fact that 35% of the British public reportedly feels well informed about the use of animals in scientific research, qualitative work, which is much more in-depth, detailed work, suggests differently. So McNaughton and Knight and Barnett, on the basis of their qualitative work, see that there are all sorts of questions that many members of the general public are unable to answer, such as how many animals are used each year, what sort of research is justified and who decides which animals are used, how are they looked after, why are the experiments done and how are they regulated, and also what sort of non-animal approaches are available. So the book that I wrote eventually sort of fell into 4 parts. So at the beginning, I look at the origins of animal research, how it bedded in, the history. Probably the bulk of the book is about the limitations of the paradigm. Part 3 is a bit more optimistic, looking at human biology-based approaches. And I finish by looking at obstacles to transition to human-based approaches. And in writing the book, I've primarily drawn on evidence, and I've tried to always use the best quality evidence available. So that might be systematic reviews or meta-analyses. But really, I've looked at a huge range of evidence to try and piece together, the story. I've drawn on my personal experience a little bit, and also interviews with experts, some of whom I think will be here today, and whose contribution was really valuable in helping to bring the book alive. And another thing that I think has been a little bit neglected in this field is theory. So I have talked about theory a little bit. So I'm just going to run through the chapters kind of quite briefly. Part 1 is 2 historical chapters. And in the first one, I ask, how did animal research begin? And I focus on the 19th century, when there was, enthusiasm about the experimental method, because it was seen as being associated with proper science like chemistry or physics. And Claude Bernard, who was a physiologist and trained in medicine, was an early exponent of the experimental method. And he wrote a book in 1865 called An Introduction to the Study of Experimental Medicine, in which he argued that studying animals under controlled laboratory conditions and then extrapolating the results to humans was a more scientific way than simply observing humans directly. And I ask who benefited from this use of animal experiments. Historians are in agreement that it was a very successful way of raising the status of physiology in medicine. But in fact, towards the end of his life, Claude Bernard actually found it quite difficult to identify any areas in which animal experiments had benefited human medicine. In the second of these historical chapters, I look at the 20th century and the ways in which animal research became locked in, how it became embedded in our institutions. So here I'm looking at the rise of big animal breeding programs that were developed to feed these scientists' need for animals. Previously, they'd been taking stray animals or getting them from other sources. I look at the influence of the two world wars because this was responsible for a huge increase in animal use, partly because of experiments on animals for chemical warfare or radiation. The rise of the pharmaceutical industry, also the rise of big government-funded national institutes of medical research, like this one at Mill Hill, north of London. And there's one in Paris as well, the Pasteur and others in major cities. I look at the influence of the Medicines Act 1968, and then sort of coming up to date with seeing how animal research is now deeply embedded in our universities and schools of medicine and life science departments. So in part two, I look at, these are chapters on the animal research methods and their outcomes. So I look at these studies themselves, and here I'm looking at the internal validity of animal studies, so the scientific quality of studies, but also the way in which they extrapolate to humans. And here I'm looking at the generalizability of these animal models to human diseases, of homogeneous animal samples to diverse human populations, the laboratory context to the messy clinical context, and of course different animal species to human species. And I also consider the impact on humans, the poor rates of translation to humans, which has led to considerable unmet need in terms of very common diseases which lack treatments, despite decades now of animal research. And also the inability of animal studies to ensure the safety of human medicines, which I argue makes us into the guinea pigs. So what can be done? Can animal studies be improved? Well, I argue only to some extent. And this is because the theory of evolution fundamentally undermines the animal research paradigm. So animal research is based on a hypothesis, so not a theory, a hypothesis of homology, which goes something like this. Because of biological similarities between humans and rats, for example, what's found in a rat will apply to humans. But of course, while species may be biologically similar, they're also likely to be significantly different biologically because they've adapted to different ecological niches. And you can see here the way in which the beaks of these finches have developed in different ways depending on the food they're eating. So the beaks for insect eating, for pecking, and for seed eating. So I argue that even if the quality of animal studies were improved, species differences would continue to make animal research unreliable. The theory of evolution explains why animal research doesn't translate reliably or consistently, but there's no actual converse theory underlying animal research which indicates why it should translate. And if there were such a robust theory, it's likely that animal research would be associated with medical advances more consistently and reliably than it is. But in fact, evidence suggests that this association is actually quite random. So this isn't to say that there haven't been medical advances that have involved animals, but I argue that you can't prove or disprove the value of a paradigm just using isolated examples. These examples only make sense in the context of a robust, explanatory, unifying theory. But we don't have such a theory. We have a hypothesis based on homology. And this hypothesis is disproved each time animal research fails to translate to humans. So then I have a more optimistic part of the book is 3 chapters on human biology-based approaches. And here I talk about human in vitro methods such as organoids, organs on chips, in silico and artificial intelligence, talk about in silico drug trials and virtual humans, and also early detection approaches such as the Galleri test, which is a single blood test, which is being piloted in the NHS at the moment among thousands of people who don't have symptoms, the idea being it's to detect hidden cancers. And this test was actually developed on the basis of Professor Azra Raza's tissue repository, which she developed over several decades using samples from her cancer patients. And she argues that early detection, is the way forward, because obviously if you can find the very earliest stages of cancer or many other diseases, then your chances of successfully and less invasively treating it are much higher. And I'm just going to read another excerpt from the book, which actually comes from my interview with Professor Raza. So she says, "This is how we're going to shift the paradigm. Within the next 10 years, we'll go from active treatment to preventative treatment. We're going to anticipate. We want to monitor wellness to find illness before it has become clinically detectable, and then try to prevent it at that stage." Azra Raza shows me the Fitbit around her wrist, explaining that it's recording her blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen levels, and all sorts of other dynamic information about her vital signs. Passionate about the potential of technology to monitor human health and wellness, she tells me that we can even be monitored at night by sheets that scan our bodies as we sleep, looking for hotspots, the areas where blood vessels grow to provide a blood supply for new tumour cells. She also points out that the treatment of a cancer that's detected early will be far less draconian than the treatment of an advanced cancer, which usually involves radiation, chemotherapy, or surgery. 90 to 95% of research funding goes into studying disease that is already far advanced, she tells me, and this is mostly done using animal models. There are, of course, other more familiar, perhaps, approaches that are human biology based. So scanning, as in MRI scans, prevention, epidemiology, which is the study of disease in human populations, post-mortem clinical trials, microdosing, and real-world data. But it's clear that there's a huge range now of human biology-based approaches that can be used in all sorts of different combinations. And given this range of tools now, which are more ethical, it just seems strange that we are still sort of conducting studies on animals and then trying to generalize them to humans. It kind of almost seems preposterous. So why are we still using animals? So this brings me to the chapters on the obstacles to transition. So I think there are many obstacles. First of all, the regulation of animal research. I mean, one of the main reasons why animal research continues is because the regulators continue to license and approve these studies, which are supposed to be only done as a last resort. Also, the regulation of pharmaceutical products, the guidance here needs to be much clearer to make it clear that people developing these treatments can actually use non-animal methods, so they don't have to use animal studies. I also argue that the 3 R's is a bit of a impediment to progress. I mean, of course, while animal research is still being done, we need to minimize suffering as much as possible. But the fact that there's so little emphasis on replacement and reduction, I think is holding any progress back. The project of trying to improve animal research, again, I think is a bit obstructive because it holds out the idea that animal research can come good one day, when in fact there's very little evidence to show that improving scientific rigor will actually improve translation. And the continuing sort of perception of animal studies as the gold standard is really difficult for people who are trying to use human biology-based methods, because they often feel that they can't get these papers published or get funding unless they include an element of animal research alongside their human biology-based approaches. And of course, there are vested interests. After over 100 years of animal research now, there are many industries that are making their livings out of using animals and supplying animals to animal research, including the makers of cages and restraints, and the breeders, and so on. So these people have very little interest in trying to, change the status quo. There's not so much funding available for human biology-based approaches either. I think it's less than 1% of the whole research budget in the UK currently goes on methods that are directly human biology-based, basic research. I think we're talking about here rather than clinical trials and so on. And of course, there are some organisations that are explicitly trying to resist any transition, such as Animal Research Tomorrow, which is an organisation that is campaigning to, well, it's insisting on the scientists' ability to use animals now and in the future, including non-human primates. But there is good news. Things that, there is a sense that things are changing. For example, the US Environmental Protection Agency's ambition to eliminate all testing on mammals by 2035. And of course, right at the end of last year, the US Senate passed the FDA Modernization Act, which means that those developing new medicines are no longer mandated to use animals, which is really good news. So that's the book in a sort of nutshell. I'm going to talk now a little bit about trying to get it published. So while I was writing the book, I was also writing a proposal to send out to literary agents, and I did manage to secure a really good literary agent from a great agency. He was really on board with the project and helped me finesse the book proposal, which is a very long document, about 50 pages long. And he sent it out to, I think, about 30 publishing houses. 22 of these replied, and the editors all engaged with the project and the ideas in the book. They made really, positive comments about it, and I'm showing you these here not to be boastful, but just to show you that they were really on board with it. They thought I was, a good person to write it, and they were, positive about the writing. But none of them wanted to publish the book. And their comments here were really, they all spoke with one voice about this. They felt that it wouldn't gain a large enough readership to make it worthwhile for them, financially. So the challenge is breaking out beyond a core animal rights readership. Not sure who the audience is. It's a bit niche, an important topic, but I can't quite picture the reader for it. It's a tough sell. I wouldn't be able to get it through an editorial meeting. Not quite clear who the audience is. The details on anything animal testing are going to be too difficult to stomach to commit to a whole book. And this was actually despite the fact that we made it really clear that we didn't go into any details about the actual nuts and bolts of animal research. So we ended up self-publishing the book with Matador, who are part of Troubadour Publishing, and who came, well recommended. And I just want to spend this last part really just talking about why perhaps editors thought this topic was such a tough sell. So obviously animal research is it's not a popular topic. Many of us don't want to think about it at all. We fear that learning about it will have a negative impact. It's what Steve Rayner calls uncomfortable knowledge. It's, once you know it, it's hard to unknow it. And Phil McNaughton, again, with his qualitative research, concluded that, on the basis of talking to lots of people in detail about this, it's something you just don't want to know, and people deal with it by switching off. Some people take active measures to avoid finding out about animal research. This is what Ronelle McLachlan calls strategic ignorance. She's done qualitative work as well too in this area, and she found that people were unclear what they would do with the knowledge if they gained it. It is precisely the responsibility that knowing confers upon publics that poses moral discomfort, and for some necessitates the act of turning away. And also those who believe animal research benefits humans may feel guilty about using medicines themselves or their families using medicines. I think there's also a sense that for some people there's no need to think about it because other people are dealing with it, and this is certainly something that Phil McNaughton again concluded on the basis of his qualitative research. He wrote, "Animal testing appears to be a background issue that most people, most of the time, prefer not to dwell upon. It's a known but hidden aspect of daily life, and one feature which helps conceal the debate from explicit public consciousness is the latent sense that other people and organisations are raising the profile of such issues, and that these are being dealt with by government and medical establishments." And I think there's also a perception that it's well regulated, and for that reason we don't need to worry about it too much. Again, this is Phil McNaughton. He writes, "Even though the issue is seen as shrouded in secrecy, people share a vague impression that the numbers of animals are diminishing, that research is being conducted in a broadly socially responsible manner, and that the frameworks of policy and regulation are familiar and responsive." It's also the case that we've had an awful lot going on over the last few years, and I think animal research has slipped down the political agenda. We've had Brexit, we've had the pandemic, we have global warming, and all sorts of culture wars being played out. So it may be that editors' views were just reflecting a general public silence on animal research. Certainly the media determine what's relevant, and animal research rarely makes the headlines these days. It used to much more, I think, maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's also true that what's avoided socially is often avoided academically, and I can certainly vouch for that. Academics are encouraged to focus on conventional topics, those where the funding is, basically. And if you don't, there will be difficulties getting employment, promotion, funding, or publication. Certainly any efforts to look at the science and value of animal research isn't something that is going to be encouraged within academia. I think there's also a legacy from the fact that critiquing the science of animal research was taboo until quite recently. I mean, with taboo, of course, there's an emphasis on avoidance, prohibitions against speaking out. And those who defy prohibitions are marginalised, as we certainly found when we wrote our paper back in 2004. We were categorised as anti-vivisection campaigners, even though we were all working within departments of public health, and four of my co-authors were professors of public health and epidemiology. And I think anyone at the time who was critiquing this was basically marginalised as being anti-human, anti-science, and providing ammunition for anti-vivisectionists. That was how it was put. And Stanley Cohen, the sociologist, says that sometimes, telling the truth is taboo. It's seen as snitching, whistleblowing, and giving comfort to the enemy. It may also be that editors' views might reflect a sort of general lack of receptivity to the message that animal research doesn't benefit humans. Because I think after 150 years of animal research, there is now a deep cultural belief that experimenting on animals saves human lives. The deaths of laboratory animals are referred to as sacrifice, the implication being that they die for our sake. And this book by Linda Burke and colleagues looks into this in quite some detail. It's a really good book. She argues that culturally we cast laboratory animals as our saviours. More generally, anthropologists have looked at sacrifice and observed that humans have a deep sense of vulnerability ingrained in our consciousness that's reinforced by suffering and death. And so against that backdrop of unpredictable events, they see sacrifice as a ritual of defence. And this Rennell McLachlan has very recently published a paper in which she observes that this belief in the power of animal research solidifies with vulnerability. such as illness or the illness of our loved ones. And I think there is a general perception among some members of the public that, there is, if you see a medication for a condition and you know that animals are involved in the development of pharmaceutical drugs, then you put two and two together and you sort of come out with the fact that animals must have been vital for the production of that drug. So I think this is a very common view. But of course, association isn't the same as causation. So what do? We kind of hold our head in our hands and give up providing information. I mean, certainly I've had a bit of a learning curve writing this book and trying to get it published. I realised that you can't just see the public as a blank slate, because some sorts of information will be resisted by some people, as this was resisted by the editors and their perception that the wider general public wouldn't want to know about it. And Stanley Cohen has written a book about this disjuncture between the state of knowing about something and then actually acknowledging it and doing something about it. And he concludes that although information won't necessarily lead to action, it is still vital, because people choose whether or not to act, but they must make informed choices. And for example, a greater knowledge about how animals are used in research is associated with lower levels of support for their use. So in conclusion, Cohen suggests that this means making more troubling information available to more people. He says informed choice requires more raw material, more statistics, reports, atlases, dictionaries, documentaries, chronicles, censuses, research, lists. And I guess I agree with him. I think we need to continue providing information, not just about the potential of new technologies, but also about the limitations of animal research. Because I think there has been a bit of a trend over the last few years, maybe the last 5, 6, 7 or 8 years, where we, in this field, have focused on the potential of new technologies and say much less now about the limitations of animal research. I think it's partly because, the same sort of messages keep coming up and people don't want to keep saying the same things. So we do need to find new ways to talk about it. We really do. And I think there is still a knowledge gap about the limitations of animal research among the general public. So I believe we do still need to talk about it and try and engage the general public. And I think amongst those of us working in the field, we need to pay more attention to basic animal research. So that's the research that's conducted within universities, blue skies, curiosity-driven research. The bulk of our attention tends to go on regulatory research, but in fact, basic animal research accounts for over 50%, certainly of the procedures in the UK. So knowledge doesn't necessarily translate into action, we know that, but it is a necessary precursor to action. So we need to keep providing knowledge, we need to keep investigating. So this is Rat Trap, this is the book that was finally published, and I'm delighted to say it's going to be available at the end of August in paperback and as an ebook. I'll come back to this slide, but I just wanted to say thank you so much to Kathy Archibald, who's read so many versions of this book, and to all the supporters of Safer Medicines Trust, without whom I really wouldn't have been able to write it, and to the people I interviewed, and to people who have read various drafts, and to the reviewers. I really offer you my heartfelt thanks for helping me with this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pandora. This I can't wait. I mean, I started reading it. You were so kind to already give me a copy, and I haven't been able to read everything, but what I read is really it's wonderful. And so the first question is that you already answered. The first question we had in the chat was about where people can order, and also in the US. Is it going to be on Amazon,
Yes.
also in the US at the same time, or just?
I don't actually know, I'm afraid. I presumed it was. I'll find out.
Okay. And then we have a lot of discussions we had in the chat while you were speaking.
Right.
That's always the disadvantage of opening the chat, but on the other hand, it's nicer for people to know who else is in the room, and they also want to share, of course, their thoughts. So there was a question about why you didn't choose a scientific publisher, and obviously, I guess it's price related, or what were your thoughts on that?
Do you mean like an academic publisher?
Yeah.
Yeah, yes, price really, because I think those tend to be at least, £20-30. And we really wanted to make this affordable so that it would reach, a much wider range of people.
Yeah, I can understand, because as you know, we published Animal Experimentation, working towards a paradigm change, Kimberly, Jane, and I, and we didn't know what we were doing basically, and it turned out to be so expensive. Thankfully, we got some funding for open access. Otherwise, I think nobody would ever buy the hardcover. I think it's over 150. Yeah, so it's really like some of the academic books are just way too expensive.
I think it would have been, it would have been much easier to publish as an academic book, but it would have been prohibitively expensive, I think.
What could be the role of using clinical veterinary data in shifting the paradigm is one of the questions. The person was always puzzled that we consider animal research to be the gold standard, but clinical data from veterinary practice doesn't even count as evidence.
I guess it depends what the purpose of the research is, what you'd be using it for. Do they mean to use it in order to generalize to humans, or?
Yeah, that's a little bit unclear, but maybe, the only thing I know is that there is a rise actually of certain cancer studies in dogs that occur naturally in dogs, and then this knowledge can be used to further human treatment, or they are trying that at least, because there are some, like bone cancer, for example, and some other cancers that seem to be similar.
It's a much more ethical way of gathering data, and it's in the real world, so it will be good data, but I think you've got to be careful about what you do with it. If it's going to be used for human medicine, then you come up against all those issues of species differences.
Yeah, and also I just remember at a conference, at a purely veterinary conference that I attended, there was some talk about animal research for animals, and I remember that the one colleague was completely shocked that they would actually make those animals sick to test something. I think it was about some ligaments that they cut, and then they looked at how they recovered, and he couldn't believe it. So he didn't even know that they do that. Obviously you could also say, if we do more humane research in veterinary medicine, you would take sick animals and use those to test.
Yes, that's a whole different area ethically, isn't it?
Is there or does there need to be anything like the FDA Modernization Act in the UK?
Yes. Yes, is the short answer to that, most definitely. Yeah, the MHRA guidelines are quite unclear about whether animals have to be used or whether human relevant approaches can be used. There's a lot of confusion, so some clarity there would be very welcome.
And wasn't there just some good developments in the UK that you had your what's it called, Animals in Research?
The Animals in Science Committee.
Science, yeah.
Yes, there was. There seems to have been a shift towards some sort of ambition to transition to human biology-based methods, which is really, really very welcome, very exciting, and quite unexpected as well.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. Then there's another question, or more a comment, a new emphasis on the 3 R's, costs of animal versus non-animal. That I guess that what the attendee is saying is that we should focus more on maybe on the monetary side of things, how much things cost, in terms of using animals versus non-animal methods.
Okay. Yes. Well, I think people are definitely beginning to look at, the economic side of these things. We've focused on the science, but there's definitely more attention now to the economics, most definitely.
And then another attendee says, I'm also increasingly convinced that 3R's research is quite ineffective, but for another reason, it tries to fix a cultural problem with a technical solution. Isn't that strategic ignorance also the main way in which we perpetuate most other forms of oppression?
Oh, that's a big question. Yeah, I mean, we don't like thinking about unpleasant things, do we? And yeah, I think what Stanley Cohen actually found out with us is that some people are prepared to look that in the face and others aren't. So it's almost like you have to look at the people who are prepared to look at it and find out about them, what makes them able to do that.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, our climate collapse problem and how people are not doing the things that we know that could help. Instead, we are trying to look for technical solutions because other things seem to be too painful. Like, for example, changing your diet would be...
Well, I certainly recommend the book by Stanley Cohen because it's all about denial of these things, such as climate change, animal research, so on. Really good book.
Would you say we could not use mosquitoes to study malaria? And then the question continues, if monology is useless, how can we try to treat one human being on the basis of what we know from another human being? Surely it is a matter of degree. The more similar, the greater the confidence is the question. And then the question is, are chimps better models for us than mosquitoes, and vice versa?
I think, whether it's a chimp or a mosquito, it's not a human. If we've got human biology-based methods that are ethical, scientifically valid and available, why on earth not use those? It's crazy to use a mosquito or a chimp when we've got a huge range of approaches that we can use instead.
Why are the limitations to current iPSC, organoid, and in silico models rarely highlighted or discussed? Organoids are highly variable and still do not capture the full complexity of a whole living being. This is particularly problematic within basic science and early drug discovery.
I think, yes, I mean, there's no methodology is perfect. Every research method, as a research approach is going to have limitations. You've got to be aware of those. And I don't think people are unaware of those. I think that, there is more effort going into looking at these potential limitations within in vitro research. And people are certainly tackling it. But yes, you're right. I mean, clinical research also suffers from all sorts of limitations. It's not just animal research. But the point with animal research is it's so controversial. So, you would expect that to do at the very least for that research to be done as well as it could be, given how controversial it is.
Yeah. And I would also say that obviously nobody's overstating what those methods can do.
No.
But they seem to have more potential. Of course, we need to work more on them and pour more funding into them, redirect funding and things like that. What I find surprising is that obviously through systematic reviews that you mentioned in the beginning, and you were one of the people who actually did a lot that this helped to tell us that we should use them for animal experimentation. There are so many animal models that are clearly not useful, and they are still authorized, they are still funded, they are still being published. And I think if we would just agree on not doing that anymore, we would already have a lot of free funding and resources for further developing the non-animal NAMs.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you. I mean, I don't think anyone's asking for more money. They're just asking to divert money away from ineffective approaches.
Yeah. And because I think it's when you discuss with scientists who use animals and you have strong opinions on the necessity, I oftentimes feel it's very like it's either or. There's not like, I think if we could at least agree on stopping certain animal experiments, I think we would really have so much more capacity to try new things. So
I know. I mean, I think, it certainly feels like stroke, where, decades of research haven't produced any treatments. The only treatment that's available is a pharmaceutical treatment, is one that was developed from the field of heart attack. So it's almost as though funders don't audit their research to see, if it's actually having any impact. I mean, it's just crazy when this research is so expensive.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. I also like sepsis is another example, and there are so many, obviously, but it would be just a start to not authorize this anymore. But it seems to be so difficult for the so-called competent authorities here in the EU and also in other places to just say, okay, we collectively decide that we are not going to authorize certain animal models anymore. And I mean, maybe we can start with a few and start to push for those that at least in our own countries and then maybe EU-wide, for example.
I mean, I think that's the trouble with the competent authorities, the regulators, is that they're so much in the, well, a lot of them are veterinary surgeons, aren't they, by background? So they're very much in the animal welfare refinement side of things, which means that they take animal research for granted. Its continuation is just assumed, rather than throwing it up in the air and saying, oh, hang on a minute, what's it actually what's it resulting in, and is it still valuable? Has it ever been valuable?
Then there's a question about the word sacrifice. Do you have you come across scientists who do not tolerate the term sacrifice? Immunologists, for example. I'd love to get your thoughts on this.
I don't know. I mean, I think it may be sort of falling out of fashion now. I think certainly it was a lot more common maybe 10 years ago. I mean, I have to do a word search on PubMed or something to see what the trend is, but I think it may be falling out of fashion a bit. I don't know if it's actually prohibited, but.
Thank you, Dr. Pound, for your clear and helpful overview of your book. How do you conceptualize the moral status or value of non-human animals? How does it compare to that of humans? Do you frame your overall view of animal research in a particular normative theory, for example, some form of utilitarianism or other theories? Thank you. And
I haven't got any sort of underlying theory. It's more of just a discomfort with the ethics of animal research, which is then sort of reinforced by the understanding of the poor science, really. So sorry, it's not a very long answer to that question. I didn't really go into the ethics in this book, the ethics of animal research, at least. Maybe focused a little bit more on the ethics of animal research for humans in the final chapter.
And then there's another question. Are you in your book recommending that animal research is banned, or do you mean it should be allowed in certain cases, or do you believe that the 3 R's principles aren't important or also not helpful?
I think as long as animal research continues, then we need to focus on animal suffering. So we need to pay attention to refinement. But the trouble with the 3 R's, by its very nature, it sort of because it takes animal research for granted, it prevents a transition really to human-based research. I've forgotten the first part of that question. Do I want it banned? Well, I mean, it would be great to find out if any of it actually works. We've never had any indication, any robust, systematic or analysis or evaluation of animal research. That would be a start. If there is an argument that some of it works, then that is an argument to be looked at. But from what we know, any progress that's associated with animal research is very random. It's not consistent, reliable method. So in my view, it means we need to start looking for a method that is much more reliable, much more consistent, more ethical, less wasteful, and more economically impactful as well. And that isn't harmful. At the moment, animal research is harming humans as well as animals.
Yeah, I think that's what many lay members or lay persons kind of forget. They always say, okay, we don't want to be tested on, but clinical trials obviously are human experiments, and I rather have a human biology based method before than just animals.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another question is, maybe you know that, who are the major funders of research on non-animal methods and human-based methods?
Well, in the UK, the Humane Research Trust and Animal Free Research UK specifically focus on animal-free research. Of course, the MRC does fund clinical research, so this is not sort of basic preclinical stuff, but it's always funded clinical research, such as clinical trials and so on. But yes, I don't think the Stroke Association funds animal research, but these are all, they're rare. Most of these charities and government funded research councils do. So
yeah, it's true. When you look at, you named a percentage. What did you say in your presentation? How many percent of the overall funding is?
I think it's less than 1% for sort of basic research in human biology based. Yeah, I think that was the estimate.
That's shocking.
It's hard to get these figures, but that was the estimate.
Yeah. I just know from the little funding I have been able to give out in the past years. There would be way more scientists who need the funding, and it's just not enough money out there for them. And obviously that also then leads to not so many people being interested in the field. I think, if you don't have possibility to get funding, then obviously that's
it's a vicious circle.
According to the latest Home Office figures, the number of animal experiments in the UK dropped 10% last year. We think this is a result of NAMS. Do you agree? So that is the question.
I don't know. I don't know is the answer to that. I was aware that the numbers have dropped, but I haven't had a chance to sort of think about why they've dropped. So I'm really sorry. If anyone else can answer that question, I'd be interested, but I don't know.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Yeah, to figure out. Maybe it has just some practical reasons. Something. Yeah, I don't know, fell through. Then another attendee says, "Thank you so much for this great presentation. What strategies do you use to reach as many people as possible and making them aware of the issues of animal testing? Which groups do you think are most perceptive for the idea, except of the obvious animal rights supporters?" So how do you reach the other?
It's really hard. That's why I wrote the book, because I just wanted to somehow reach, beyond this audience that, the people that we know. It's very hard because, if you just talk to friends of friends and acquaintances, then you realize that there's still a huge part of the population that just still believes that animal research is vitally important. So, that's why I was really keen on making sure it wasn't, that it was a paperback, it was cheap to affordable, it's available as an ebook. I was just hoping that, the more accessible and affordable it was, it would, and if it does end up in bookshops, then people might pick it up and read it. But it's a huge challenge, really, to break out into different parts of the population. But some people will be resistant to it; they just will not. But there are groups that are receptive. And as I think I concluded, you've just got to keep putting the information out there and trying to engage people with, new ways of saying things. There's lots of different ways to say things. I just think, we've got to try and we're going to have to get our heads together and be more imaginative about engaging people, different messages. But, that's why I talk a little bit about theory, because it's something that we don't really talk about much in this field. And yet it's important,
Yeah, and there are definitely different approaches, and even just making students in that case, when you work in academia, aware of that they have to scrutinize everything, that they just shouldn't take anything for granted because just because somebody tells them, this is the only way. So that's, I think, critical thinking skills, teach those. Then there's another question. What would be your advice on how to communicate the limitations of animal research as an academic researcher?
Well, maybe don't do it as an academic. Try and do it more as a layperson. I guess it's really the same answer to the last question, really. We've just got to be imaginative about our message. But I do think that we need to talk about the limitations of animal research and the potential of new approaches. Because I don't think we talk about animal research so much nowadays. I don't know if you think that's true. It's almost become taboo to, in our field to mention these things. We just talk about the positive stuff all the time.
I understand the logic in not publishing via academic press, but it does require peer review, which provides the reader with assurance, supposedly, that this has passed a high bar of credibility. How can you evidence this?
It's not an academic book. It draws on academic literature, and I'm super keen on evidence. So every statement I make is backed up by evidence, and it's the best evidence I can find at the time. But it's not an academic document, so it's not appropriate really to subject it to that sort of review. It has been read by lots of people in the field prior to it being published, so I have had informal peer review.
Okay, then another question is, the person they'd like to ask to which extent you believe the publish or perish pressure and that this contributes to animal use nowadays.
Yeah, I think so. I think animal research has always been, it's produced scientific publications much more quickly than clinical research does. Clinical research is messy, it takes a long time. But, animal research can be converted into publications relatively quickly. And I think, that's why people doing PhDs are encouraged to do it, because, it helps build your CV, your PhD, your academic career.
If more researchers like Dr. Pound were to attempt publications like this to the general public, would not more publishers take such intended publications more seriously?
Yes, I think so. I think it's partly because there's such silence about this that, they were frightened to go near it. Absolutely. I think the more books that are out there, and the popular science books that are out there, the more they'll realize that there is an interest. So it is a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. But the fact that there isn't anything makes them think there's no interest. But they may be right. Perhaps nobody will buy it. I don't know.
Yeah, we will see how your book will sell. And also, I remember, Richard Harris's book that sold very well. I think. It was, and that was, when was that? In 2017 it was published, I think.
And that's all about the scientific method.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And it was super interesting, with interviews from scientists about what they think the flaws are and the problems are. I thought it
Yeah, it's a good book.
Yeah. So, so I think there is maybe more, there would be a readership for it, but obviously, yeah, maybe.
Well, I mean, it's strange that you mentioned that book because that was one of the key books that I mentioned in trying to promote it to publishers. They're saying, this was something that people were interested in.
Yeah.
And I think he included a chapter on animal research, didn't he, in that book?
Yeah, even he wrote quite a lot about animal research. Rigor Mortis, for everybody who hasn't heard about that book, it's also worthwhile reading. And yeah, I thought it was very fascinating, and he got a lot of attention for this as well.
Yeah,
so yeah,
it's a very good book.
Yeah. Do any schools teach the transition to human biology-based research is another question.
You'd probably be better to answer that one than me.
I know that the JRC, the Joint Research Center, is doing a lot to promote the 3 Rs being taught in schools, but unfortunately, still the 3 Rs principles. And actually, I do agree with you that after over 60 years, we should maybe finally, because the problem with the 3 Rs principles, it is focused on animal experimentation. It is these 3 Rs of animal experimentation. So it's not really thinking outside of the box of this,
No.
concept. And I think that's why we should maybe, I
mean, that's why the recent intervention from the Animals in Science Committee is so exciting, because they are really saying, no, we need to think outside the box here.
Yeah.
So we'll have to see what happens with that.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess everybody knows that if we are under pressure with coming up with new solutions, we normally do. So I think sometimes it just takes a little bit of pressure to change our ways, because I think that's a human trait that we like to do things the way we've always done them, and that's problematic.
Absolutely.
And then there's another question of somebody who says, I got my PhD in the cancer field. Since then, I am looking for a postdoc on molecular oncology, but all regular job posting websites do not filter by animal research or NAM, or not using animal or non-animal research. Do you know if there is specific websites for searching postdoc positions with no animal use in the biofield?
Is that in the UK?
That's a good question. I mean, maybe you mentioned the UK ones, and then I can come up with some other ones.
Well, I mean, I would certainly contact Animal Free Research UK and the Humane Research Trust in the UK.
And what I can highly recommend, Animal Free Research UK has this amazing platform for scientists, where you can become a member, and they always have job postings, and they have webinar postings, and they have new publications inform about them. If you're based in the US, PCRM, Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, they have a website dedicated for early career scientists, and they also have a newsletter that you should sign up for. I can put some information about that together. And also in Germany, there's a website, In Vitro Jobs. So I will just put some information together and send it in a follow-up email to everybody. Because I think, that's our future. Then the next generation of scientists who are interested in those new methods. How does Dr. Pound think we can convince journal editors and grant award bodies not to compare human methods to animal methods when reviewing papers and projects? Is another question.
Oh, I wish I knew. Yeah. It's just part of a wider cultural shift that's going to have to happen. I don't think, by specifically focusing on funders or journal editors, it's just got to be part of a wider shift to transition. But, I might be wrong. There might be some really good suggestions there.
And another question is, can you expand your comment regarding the Animals in Science Committee shift from animal experimentation?
So there was a letter written by the chair of the Animals in Science Committee, who's Professor David Main. It's on the UK government website under the Animals in Science Regulation Unit part of the website. And he has written a letter to, I think it's Lord Sharp of Epsom, who I think might be Science Minister of some sort, in which he is suggesting that the UK needs to start thinking about human biology-based approaches, and he recognises the potential of them and the economic potential of them and the scientific potential, and he's also suggesting that I think the policy function be moved from the Home Office to the Department for Science, Trade and Industry or something. I can't remember which one, but anyway, a much more appropriate department that would be able to actually pull some levers in that direction. But yeah, go on, read the letter. It's all publicly available. I mean, we don't know what the response will be, but it's a good development at least.
Yeah, it's giving some hope. Does anybody know why the Sanger Institute decided to close its GMO mouse unit and why the MRC decided to close the Havel GMO mouse unit?
I think the reason they gave was that there was less demand for that research. And they did mention human biology-based methods were being used more. So, yeah, I don't know if there were other reasons, but I think that was certainly part of the reasoning.
Yeah, it makes sense, right? It's like, unfortunately, when you look at genetically modifying animals, you can't really say that it has helped much with translation. So no. I think that should really make us think of changing method.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was their kind of attempt to deal with species differences, but it hasn't worked.
Exactly. Another question, what is a realistic historical objective for developers of non-animal research methods? Isn't there a business case for developing centers for developing non-animal research methods inside AMCs, academic medical centers, in part because vivisectionists know that they would want to know what they would want to discover and could advise in the development of such replacement methods with which the biomedical research tool could be supplemented or bolstered?
I'm not sure what the question was.
So the question is, like, how can we develop methods that are what scientists actually think they need for their toolkit? That's how I understand it, because they're talking about having those centers for the academic medical centers, that you develop NAMs for scientists working in academic medical centers. And so how can we, it sounds like they want to complement the animal models with NAMs. And so basically, how can they collaborate with animal experimenters working on certain medical research?
Right. I mean, the thing it makes me think of is the helpathons in, the Dutch helpathons, where animal researchers and NAMS developers get together and talk. And I think it's more that the animal researchers are asking for help in this case to try and do the research without using animals. But it is an example of communication between the two. Yeah. Just trying to think. Yeah, I mean, again, it sort of presumes that you want to try and, does it presume that you want to try and develop like for like replacements? I don't know, which may be a bit of a problem. I think sometimes just asking questions differently might be more helpful.
Yeah, actually, I want to come back to what you said about basic research. Obviously, that's something that's happening within the universities. And mainly, unfortunately, with animals, obviously, there's no reason to use NAMs for this. Can you elaborate a little bit more on your thoughts on how we can shift there?
Yeah, well, we need to really be thinking about that. I mean, it's tricky because the objective of that research is so vague, and so it's very hard to assess it or evaluate it. But I think, I mean, as a social scientist, you just feel like you want to go in there and talk to people and see what sort of research is being done and why. I guess the other way of looking at it is looking at the non-technical summaries. You get quite a good idea of the sort of research that's going on, but it does need some sort of scrutiny, much more scrutiny than it's under at the moment.
Yeah, it's. I think that many more students would be open for not using animals if they have alternatives, and also for basic research. And obviously, that changes with the professors who are in charge in those places as well. So I don't know. It's a generation shift, but it's maybe not. It's not fast enough as well, right?
Yeah, I think we need to somehow find out a bit more about that, because it seems to me it has a sense of being very closed and not much known. I mean, I did try to, when I was at Bristol University, tried to talk to some people doing animal research there, and they wasn't particularly welcoming in terms of talking to what I felt was an outsider. There's still a very defensive kind of attitude. But yeah, somehow we need to just learn a bit more about that research so that we can work out what to do.
Yeah, I don't know. From my experience, it seems to be very much dependent on, the head of the research group, how open they are, and what their methods are, and then depending on what their methods are, that's what they teach their students. Another question: should editors in scientific journals not require that some of their articles come from researchers using non-animal research methods? If they did, would not their research community readers, would they not be able to see some of the scientific products of non-animal research methods, and thus the scientific potentials of each of these methods that would be on display in the publications?
Well, I mean, a lot of human relevant research is obviously published. The trouble is, I think, people who do animal research don't read those journals. They don't read Oltex or other places where it's published. The two fields of research are so separate, I feel. Well, in many ways, they're very separate. They, publish in different journals, read different journals. But you're not going to be able to force an editor of a journal that mainly publishes animal research to suddenly start. Well, I mean, you can't force them, but you can hope that people will start submitting their non-animal research to that journal and create some sort of pressure that way, I guess.
But I'm so glad that you wrote this book and gave us some food for thought today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, no, it was wonderful. When I heard, I knew that you were working on this book, and I thought I need to ask you if you want to speak in our webinar series. And I feel honored that we could do the book launch today. There was one last question about, will there be an official press release when the book comes out that people can circulate?
So I think the publisher's going to start doing that sort of thing. Well, they said the beginning of August, so that should be happening this week or next week. But I would just suggest, if anyone does want to contact me, then I can give them the information they need. Obviously, we'd really welcome help to sort of spread the word about the book and try and get it distributed as widely as possible. So I'd be more than happy to, give people whatever they need. if they want to do that.
Yeah, thank you so much. And there are many thank you notes in the chat for you, and everybody's excited.
Thank you.
To read your book. So thanks a lot, and also for taking the time to talk to us. And yeah, I hope we can.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you. And thanks to everyone who's listened and asked lots of questions.